Hello everyone. Welcome to round 3 of this year's Australs. I'm Nicole from the University of the Philippines, Diliman, and I'm chairing this round. Together with me, our room's trainee is Huirong Dong. So we are doing the second motion that we prefer a world where sports are not commercialized. Without any further ado, I would like to invite the first proposition speaker to begin the debate. Here, here. Sorry, just to be very, very clear about this again. So all of the teams here consent to be live streamed. Is that correct? And
Team negative confirms to live stream.
understand. Prop team?
Yeah, prop team consents to being live streamed as well.
All right, thank you so much. So without any further ado again, let's invite now the first proposition speaker. Here, here.
All right, before that, a bit of a mic check. Am I clearly audible? If not, I would like to know the same.
You are clear.
All right, then it's okay. Just give me like 10 seconds to set up my timer. All right, I guess we're good to go. Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. Panel, what do we mean by a world where sports are commercialized, right? Firstly, we think point at which you commercialize sports, it sets out a narrative. The narrative is this. We think that the world, how they're going to view sports are going to be through the lens of commercialization, through a lens of profit maximization, through an optics that you try to get the maximum utilitarian benefits in the form of profits, which means it becomes like a capitalistic hegemonic structure where the only incentive or the primary incentive of players as well as the entire infrastructure surrounding sports becomes one through which you maximize profit, and that's what the utilitarian benefit comes out of it. And why we think essentially it does way more harm than good, since it's a preface motion, we believe, point at which we show it to you that commercialization does way more damage to sports as a whole compared to the benefits that side negative can argue. We think we take this debate. Firstly, why do we think it affects sports, and why do we think it puts an unfair burden of expectations on players to begin with? Firstly, we think when players are commodified, that is to say your value as a player essentially is contingent on the market price of the tag that you essentially control in the market. At this particular point of time, we feel that sports players compete with each other for the sake of, because at this point of time when you create such a toxic capitalistic environment, the only metric that essentially comes through is one that you compete with others in terms of money, who can fetch the higher price tag in the market, etc., etc. At this point of time, the amount of backlash that essentially comes through when you're not able to perform because you know that you're never going to get that contract because of the capitalistic structure that essentially exists. I believe it puts an unfair burden of expectations on players that takes a toll on their mental health, and essentially players who can't cope up with this kind of a structure essentially tend to lose out. At that particular point of time, we feel that the essential commodification or putting up a price tag essentially does way more harm in terms of the burden of expectations that it thrusts on players to essentially perform. Point at which you don't, we believe the amount of backlash and the fallout is going to be way higher, that players tend to get into depression and suffer from trauma and are incredibly difficult for them to get back. Secondly, why do we think there are harms, right? We are going to characterize two level harms. Firstly, why it damages the very sport internally, and secondly, why it damages other sports in the country from essentially coming up. Firstly, why do we think that it does internal damage to the sport? We think that sports have multiple formats within themselves. That is to say for example, cricket has got multiple formats in the form of test cricket or T20 cricket, etc. The difference is this, one takes place over a span of 5 days, the other one takes place over say hardly like 4 hours or something of that sort in the form of T20. Point at which capitalization kicks in, and point at which commercialization becomes the overarching narrative. At that particular point of time, like say for example, a particular version will always be promoted over the other. That is to say, T20 cricket being promoted over Test cricket under all circumstances. That is to say, we see a lack of viewership in Test cricket. We see very less players being engaging to co-opt into Test cricket. And why do we think that, like, preservation of formats is also important? We think every format demands a specific skill set. That is to say, a Test cricket match that is played over 5 days requires other specific skills. That is to say, endurance. That is to say, patience. That is to say, your ability to deal with your ability to like sweat it out in the field in terms of an enduring structure. That those kind of specific skill sets are required to survive in that particular format. Compare that to a T20 cricket, which only values things like neural reflexes or how fast you can score runs and essentially how you can move up the runs. At that point, we believe people who have those specific skill sets, who could have like played Test cricket, essentially lose out because their format or perhaps the skill sets that they could have utilized in that particular format get no recognition and essentially get very less recognition, and the access point gets incredibly clouded out by the one overarching format. That is the point that this takes place. Couple that, say for example, with the media narratives that essentially surround this entire setup. That is to say, media right now is much more likely to promote T20 cricket over any other form of cricket. That is to say, the IPL that takes place in India or the KFC T20 Big Bash that takes place in Australia. At this point of time, this promotion of one particular format over the other kills the other format of the sport and essentially disincentivizes people from essentially like opting or playing into that format. That also means disenfranchising a certain skill sets of players that essentially could have played that. Secondly, in terms of why other sports in the country suffer, and this is primarily happens in like say a developing country like India, where traditional sports such as hockey, traditional sports that have essentially like played a role in the historical development of a country, say for example sports that people derive their cultural value out of, and say for example sports that have like played a role in say for example shaping the country's history, those sports tend to suffer because they simply cannot fit into the commercialized bracket. That is to say, cricket in India is overarchingly promoted than any other sport. What's the ripple down effect of this? The ripple down effect of this is other sports are greatly disincentivized and disenfranchised. Point at which they don't get media viewership, less people are likely to watch these sports at that particular point of time, because like this is an entire commercialized hegemonic structure. Because these companies don't get utility out of the sports, there are less number of leagues, there are less number of say alternative venues or alternative say formats or leagues that essentially promote hockey or promote such other traditional sports at that point of time. And also like government infrastructure, right? At this point of time, we see like literally the world's largest cricket stadium being built in Gujarat, where India doesn't have infrastructure to support its team in the Olympics, or say for example promote infrastructure in terms of hockey, which means it clouds out the country's perspective to compete in other alternate sports. That also automatically means you disenfranchise other people who have essentially played those sports and entered into that market, which is one particular format and one particular sport getting an overarching effect in the entire country due to commercialization, disincentivizes and disenfranchises all the other sports and people who could have opted for the same, which means everyone now has to conform to cricket or everyone has to conform to T20 to essentially emancipate themselves in the field of sports. If like you want to play hockey or you want to play basketball or perhaps even compete in the Olympics, like these developing countries like primarily like India don't have the infrastructure to support you through, and the government and the media mechanism and capitalistic ventures play into the same narrative. Secondly, why do we think it entrenches patriarchy? And that is a principal harm that comes out of it. Point is, this is already a societal perception that men possess much more masculine traits in form of aggression, the gladiator-like abilities that historically it's men who had been fighting, say for example in the Colosseum, and men are much more capable to essentially participate in sports and are much more fit to be sports persons to begin with. Companies and media narratives play into this very role. That is to say, you promote men's cricket and you promote men's football over women's football at all points of time. That is the very reason why a women's cricket World Cup final has less amount of viewership and audience than a men's warm-up match. Because at this point of time, the entire media narrative and the advertisement plays into these vulnerable societal perceptions that already exist, which is at this point of time you create a deadlock. That is to say, you always see men's sports being promoted and say for example men's cricket being promoted. At this particular point of time, say women who could have entered the sport market, because sure, if negative comes and argues in terms of more media exposure leading to more people recognizing it, we believe at that point the development is asymmetric. It only benefits men and it only promotes men's cricket. That is to say, female players will never get the incentive to perform. That is to say, everyone and the amount of like media narrative that surrounds in terms of commercialization, brands that run after players who have won. That is to say, everyone knows Usain Bolt is the fastest man in the world or has won, say for example, the 100 meters in the Olympics. Nobody knows who was the women like 100 meters champion. That is the kind of media narrative that surrounds this very structure. That is to say, it feeds into patriarchy at the point at which this capitalism is also like controlled by like media corporations, which are controlled by like say cis het males in the society. We believe this entrenchment of capitalism further disincentivizes women. That is to say, asymmetrically favors men in this kind of a scenario. What we have told you from side affirmative, we have told you as to why it puts a price tag in form of commodification of players and puts a burden of expectations. We have told you why it damages the sport internally as well as other sports in the country that can perhaps come up. And thirdly, we have told you why it entrenches patriarchy on their side of the house, point at which you go ahead and commercialize. For all these pragmatic harms, we believe you would prefer a world in which sports aren't commercialized. Proud to.
Yeah, I would like to thank the first proposition speaker for their speech. So you guys are also encouraged to turn your cameras on, but if you do not wish to do so, or if you would like encounter tech difficulties, there should be no worries as well. But yep, now to open the case of the negative bench, I'd like to invite the first negative speaker. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
All right, I'll start in a few seconds. Just
is that video on going?
the concern from side affirmative in regards to the profit maximization incentive of commercial sports is that the profit maximization incentive itself is bad. The argument that we like to pose in our side is when you do cost benefit analysis of the sports in regards to this, the profit maximization incentive has led to a myriad of funds being directed towards the sports. It has also led to better training opportunities for managers and also for players, also for coaches. This means that all of this profit that goes in is invested into the sports, making the sports more accessible and more better for a lot of people that comes into it. So if you are talking about the nature of money that comes into sports, it is also important to note where this money goes and diversified into. But the fact is, if you are trying to talk about players that are commodified, and that is something that is to be demonized or bad, there are also players who have retained the positions of power by refusing to get transfer. People like Messi, Lampard, Gerrard, who do not want to get commodified and go out of that. But notice here, when in your case, in your world, when people do not have enough money to feed their families, because sports is not that commercialized and hence not that popular across the global spectrum, means that there are less number of people able to pay for that ability that you have, or rather hewn that ability means the specific capacity of the player to get money and then get power in regards to the economic prosperity that he can have or she can have is something that is limited within that sports. The conception next seems to be that other forms of sports are not prioritized. Our stance is clear. We believe that whenever in your alternate world as well, the historically important sports like hockey in India or probably rugby in England or cricket in England as well would have been prioritized disproportionately over other forms of sports. Our comparative is at least we have a global access. For example, T20 cricket in India is the reason why so many countries in so many places prioritize cricket and train players specifically to bring into that league. EPL entertains players and viewership from all across the globe. It also means that there are different different nature of funding that comes into different types of leagues. For example, England has different leagues in regards to rugby, in regards to football, in regards to cricket, tennis, and everything, right? So there is commercialization and incentive to commercialize for diverse group of audience who want to see different varieties of sports. The content here is we have global people willing to pay to watch that sports means we have greater incentive to prioritize all these individual sports other than in the alternate world. So what are the arguments that we are trying to pose in this debate? We have a few arguments here. Firstly, sports becomes more global. This means that we have recognition of talents all across the world, and everyone, where even the sports is not globalized or glamorified, can have some level of pleasure from viewership of this kind of sports. Secondly, the revenue and finances where it gets invested upon and the kind of outputs that players, managers, and fans received. Thirdly, on the sports and the intrinsic value of sports. And fourthly, the sports as a vehicle for social movement in regards to countering Islamophobia, in regards to countering racism, in regards to the role models that promote that. So firstly, why do we think that sports has become more of a global sport? We believe that it has increased exposure to places where it was never before. That means there is a global increase in fund, and there is a global excitement upon people to train for that kind of opportunity. When sport becomes lucrative, a lot of people all across the globe want to be involved in that particular platform. This means it is a global exposure. For example, when Manchester United sells merchandise all across the world, that means we have a greater sense of community and belongingness to that particular club. A Liverpool fan in Nepal is going to feel happy and fascinated at the fact that their club won the Premier League. Alternatively, that would not occur in the side of the house. But it is also important to note that this global exposure leads to national leagues also being promoted. For example, the ESL or EFL in Barclays Premier League in England has led to Everest Premier League in Nepal. This means also ISL in India, which means that players, like a lot of players, are going to come in. A lot of coaches are going to come in from international level, bringing about training and skills that you could exclusively get on our side of the house. The limitation that you face on your side is the player being limited by the ability that they got at their birth, and the limitation around the platform that they exist in their side of the house. Next thing is important to note is the global incorporation of other people. What do we mean by that? That is to mean recognition of talents across different races, religions, like incorporation of Asian and African people in white westernized football as well. It also involves the places, people from rural areas. For example, Dhoni coming in from Ranchi and probably being the captain of India, Neymar coming in from streets, Pele coming in from streets. And that means a lot of inspiration also goes in down to that local level, but it also means people from all across the table have an ability to come into the table. But next important thing to note is even the commercial incentives mean people have to look for these young talents, people who are placed in these rural areas, so that they can come about and become an important part as well. The importance of this argument is these people who come from these specific areas become the role model for these areas and the bastion of hope. For example, Mohamed Salah becoming the role bastion for against racism, against Islamophobia, and a lot of these things. Second thing, it's important to note the maximization of revenue, the increase in funding or investment means that you have more money available for the managers, more money available for the teams, more money that increases the scope of stadium, increases the level of advertisement, means outreach of the sports increases, the amount of pleasure you can have in regards to viewing that sports increases. It also means people who cannot go to EPL and watch that can now watch that in TV when there is a commercial incentive to market that over that platform as well. Next thing that's important to note is the inherent value of sports that we want to prioritize on our side, because we believe that we can now get best form of trainings because we are paying a lot of money and there is a competition for that. Best form of sports because people are competing in order to be best in regards to that. But there are so many different avenues through which they can compete. That is to mean sports increases as a field. The alternative in your side is that people don't sports is not central to how people want to earn their money. So with people with financial incentives, going into sports is just a bad idea. They would otherwise be incentivized to go or become an engineer, become a doctor. This means people who want to exercise their platform in terms of sports are discouraged in your side of the house. Our side allows people to maximize their learning and ability beyond their inherent capacities. It's important to note that. Lastly, in regards to Islamophobia and racism and movement, Mohamed Salah, Asian and black people, people like Michael Jordan actively coming out and speaking against racism tells a lot, because they are role models of that player who can speak to their fan base and have greater ability to sway them. But it's also important to note when when knee take happens in Premier League, where people just advocate, when Premier League players advocate against police brutality, this furthers the prospect of BLM movement throughout the globe. It is important to note that the issues that affect these people can be politicized around sports just because it is commercialized to the level that is accessible to all of these people. It is important to note that all of this happens. But lastly, on the extraneous rebuttal about inclusion of patriarchal harms, notice that this is not exclusive to our side. Alternatively, in their side, men and women both cannot have access to sports, but it also means disproportionately women are affected more because sports are still historically tied to women. This is an argument against sport entirely, not just argument against commercialization. But we say with commercialization, we have increased incentives for women to participate as well. So yeah, that means we have increased incentives for women football and women World Cup as well. So we are very proud to oppose. Thank you. I hope I was audible the whole time.
I would like to thank the first negative speaker for their speech. Now to continue the case of the affirmative bench, we now call on the second proposition speaker, please. You're here.
Just testing if this is audible.
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm just setting up my timer.
Can anyone from the outcome probably mute me? I am unable to mute myself because my mouse stopped working. So if it's possible, if someone can mute me.
There.
Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, to begin with certain rebuttals to what we got from side opposition before moving on with our constructive case, right? They talk about how, and this is like a presupposition that comes about in the very beginning of their speech when they talk about like how this sort of commercialization is going to lead to better opportunities, how profit is going to be invested back within these sort of spaces in the first place, right? Except that this is not true because of the fact that like these sort of sports have gotten like this degree of media attention and this degree of like, you know, elitism that is attached to it now as a consequence of this high stature and this high pedestal it's going to be put on. It means that like the incentive for commercial enterprises to like charge less for these sort of sporting goods and services, to charge less for say training at cricket clubs, and to charge less for this sort of access point, given that so many people want it and so many people want it so badly to be like a part of these sort of sporting spaces, is like this sort of incentive does not exist, right? So like the investment back into it is like something that we believe is not really going to pan out in the way that they're talking about. Then with respect to their points about like global access and how this really looks like within like a modern scenario, right? Understand that this means that it has to be palatable to a specific audience, which means that this is generally like a Western Eurocentric audience, and that a lot of sports tend to be and a lot of these sort of sports tend to be like directed towards and tend to like have this sort of appeal, which means that it comes at cost to these sort of regional sports that exist and these sort of sports that are tied in within specific countries' cultures, because they now don't have this sort of reach and audience, right? Which does not mean in any way that this sport is not good, or it does not like say have any sort of impact in terms of its actual quality or what it does for the people from that state, right? So we tell you that this sort of globalization doesn't necessarily translate to better quality in the sense that they're talking about. Then also with respect to people like and the sort of access to these sort of sports in the first place, right? We tell you that like these sort of individuals that they're talking about are exceptions to the rule. That is to say, at the point at which cricket becomes so commercialized within an Indian space, it becomes incredibly difficult for individuals to be able to pay for that training, to be able to be a part of like spaces where they have opportunities to reach these higher rungs, right? We tell you that this sort of lucrative space only exists with respect to the very top layers of individuals who at the point at which like these sort of spaces for cricket tend to become commercial and have this sort of viewership and audience, not with respect to the sport as a whole, in like any sort of regional sense or in any sort of like localized sense in terms of how these things actually pan out, right? We tell you that their examples of ISL and IPL are incredibly uncomparative on that front, because these sort of revenues are higher for IPL, and the ISL itself is incredibly niche, right? Then coming to their points about like how social movements pan out, understand that what they're talking about is like inexclusive to to this commercialization of sports, but instead is linked with celebrity itself, right? Also, the likelihood for sports individuals to come out and speak out about these things is incredibly limited by the fact that they have commercial capitalist ties to certain companies like Nike or Adidas or whatever, which means that they're not like incentivized to make like strong stances about these sort of issues. Instead, they're more likely to say like PC sort of things that are going to appeal to the general public, that won't get them into trouble and that won't be in contradiction with already like with their existing fan base, right? That is to say, a lot of individuals who watch sports also tend to have this sort of toxic sort of sense with respect to how like the people who are like who belong to the LGBT community are treated, and that is something that sports people have no incentive to change because they're so critically dependent on their fan base and this sort of viewership as compared to say like their actual playing quality and stuff like that, right? Also, the individuals who get paid the most tend to be individuals, and this comes in with our constructive case, which tends to be individuals who have like the scope for being like advertised well, not with respect to their actual ability, right? That is to say, someone like Dhoni or someone like Virat Kohli looks better on a poster and is like capable of selling these sort of products better than say someone like Duti Chand who has like incredible achievements within the respects of say female athletes and stuff like that, right? Because they don't appeal to this major mass audience. And that is like the critical point that comes out from Rito's speech, which is to say, what is the metric of evaluation of the capacities of these individuals now? It becomes like commercially sellable qualities as compared to like their actual like quality of playing, right? And this is critical with respect to the aspect on like masculine hegemony of sports, because now given that like women already within status quo tend to not have access or appeal within these sort of sporting spaces, because there is like this sort of incredible levels of gatekeeping, it means that these women will never have the scope to come up, because like it's so fundamentally and intrinsically tied now to the viewership that it has and the kind of like audience that it can reach to, right? Which means that this sort of barrier of entry and this metric of oppression is going to continue to like get entrenched within status quo, right? Also understand that when they like the sort of industries that like come up around these sort of sports, that is to say like gambling based industries and like match fixing scandals and stuff that come up because of this sort of incredibly high sort of linkage with these sort of sporting industries as commercial ventures. That is to say that it becomes much more exciting for fans when matches are made close, or when there is some sort of profit that can be gained through these sort of spaces, right? So that means that these sort of spaces aren't like truly about like sportsman spirit and honesty and stuff like that, but instead are like easily swayed in this manner. How is it worse off for players themselves, right? Because like there's a huge sort of toxic fan base with respect to these individuals who are put in terms on a microscope, under a microscope, and face huge backlash for any sort of sporting mishaps, right? That is to say, like people like Anushka Sharma getting blamed for things to do with like Virat Kohli's performance and stuff, which is incredibly problematic. This also puts a huge burden of tension, a huge burden of being representative of like a national interest. That is to say, when there is like matches between India and Pakistan, the burden of like representing their country and being representative specifically with respect to these socio-political tensions that exist is like unfairly pinned on these sports people, which means that this huge sort of burden of expectations now is going to affect their sort of performance that they can actually give out, and is going to like weigh heavily upon them and their mental states, right? Which means that it's become like an incredibly difficult space for them to really like access. Also, with respect to like the commercialization, there has been like an increase in the privatization of sports related infrastructure as well, which means that like deserving candidates may not be able to access this like proper high quality sporting infrastructure, which is critical for them to come up and like be able to like say actually get these sort of lucrative high paying sports based careers and professions that like opposition wants to talk to you about in the first place. So at the point at which this is like so regulated by these commercial enterprises, it becomes incredibly difficult for this to like for these individuals to like actually get access to it and like have this sort of space in the first place, right? We tell you that this sort of team spirit, like this sort of toxic gatekeeping that exists within these spaces is incredibly problematic, because now like these sort of rules get modified specifically for commercial interest. That is to say, someone like a Rahul Dravid will never come up and gain prominence, because like it is not like, because it's not appealing to the audience within this aspect, right? We tell you that the audience tends to watch this definitively comes at the cost to other sort of sporting ventures in the first place. So opposition cannot run away by arguing that, oh, nobody would have access to this sort of sports as a whole because because there's no commercialization, right? That is to say, like, the quality of sports we believe is going to be better, more people have access to it, and therefore overall sports as a whole benefits without having the sort of detriments that come from like a huge audience which is focused on your advertising capacities and not on your intrinsic skills. For all these reasons, incredibly proud to propose.
We would like to thank the second proposition speaker for their speech. Now, to continue the case of the negative bench, we now invite the second negative speaker, please. Here.
On.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Mr. Ranjan, you were saying? Yeah.
Give me a minute, like my pen stopped writing, so I'll just get another pen.
That's fine.
Yep.
Okay, I'm back. Thank you.
All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to engage with side affirmative in 2 important points. First, on about whether or not these clubs have incentive to engage locally, and second, on regards to the lack of counterfactual about what would sports look like on their side and how would they change the kind of problems that they have identified on the status quo as well. But first, let's attack them in their lack of counterfactual. They at no point in their speech, in 16 minutes of their speech, have specified what the counterfactual is. What is the world they're trying to prefer? Are they trying to make sports very, very local, where only local products are being prioritized over global market? Are they only prioritizing sports that are central to national identity, in a sense that they will prioritize, say, for example, game between India and Pakistan, but not necessarily between clubs that are so crucial and centralized to this capitalistic commercialization that they so regret, etc. We think they have to clarify counterfactual, and I think it's too late for government whip to come here and identify what is the kind of world that they prefer in a prefers motion as well. But second, let's then go into their case, right? Let's compare things that they have accused of us, and let's try to deal with them step by step. The first concern that they had was, okay, in the present, sportspersons have a lot of pressure within themselves to perform because they are surrounded by a fan base and they're surrounded by a club that puts certain value to them. But the problem with that is, under their side, these individuals probably still want to perform. These individuals probably still want to pursue their dreams, the dreams that they had to represent their country or represent their local club, etc. Under their side, the problem is because they do not have enough funding, because funding is likely to be less with the absence of commercialization, right? For example, it would look like probably funding in a developing nation like San Miro or Nepal, where sports aren't necessarily very, very commercialized, right? In these cases, effectively, which means is that many players have to give up their dream and pursue alternative careers, which would probably make them a lot sadder because they will not be able to pursue things of their dreams. They would probably never be able to go out and score a goal in Wembley and celebrate by sliding into a corner flag, etc., which probably is more traumatic for these individuals because they will never be able to be in a position where they can pursue their dreams to a degree where they can feel good as well. Under their side, we think people are likely to have their dream crushed lot more. But second, if their case is about match fixing and if their case is about fall playing that goes around sports, then we think it can be categorically tackled better. Because we have seen EPL taking measures against illegal betting. We've seen players being banned for 4 and 5 months. For example, Daniel Sturridge recently was banned for 5 months from football after placing an illegal bet in the game in Turkey, right? We've seen these kinds of measures being taken in order to deal with that. Probably IPL is doing bad because there are other structural problems with IPL, but a lot of commercialized sports all around the world, be it NFL, be it EPL, be it all parts of the world, globally, we've seen that commercialized sports has had effective forms of regulations, and these things have been working as well. Further, their idea about patriarchy and why that's central to sports and why commercialized perpetuate it. We disagree to it, right? We've seen corporate sector being liberalizing to a degree where these individuals are recently trying to, be more for the liberal movements, etc. That's the reason as to why we've seen English Premier League supporting LGBTQ plus support groups and wearing a rainbow armband and laces in support of LGBTQ plus communities. We've seen recently Serena Williams and Maria Sharapova and other the captain of US football team, US women's football team, etc., getting a lot of media coverages, which has done significantly in order to ensure that there is a change in public consciousness. When there is no commercialization in sports, when sports aren't subscribed globally, your incentive to effectively create these forms of narrative shift for the media goes away as well, which means under their side, probably sports is likely to be more patriarchal, and probably under their side, they will not see the rise of sports such as, Women Premier League, probably rise of women's football. Recently in the game, in the finals of, Women World Cup, 50,000 plus people attended that match. Under their side, that would probably never have happened because of lack of change, that the lack of incentive to change that their side has as well. But further on, it's harmful for sports under their side as well. We think sports under their side will be largely local, which means a lot of benefit that comes from our leader of opposition speech will not be attained under their side, which means the quality of players will be less, the coaching will be less, the quality of coaches will be less, which means significantly the interactions of global players and global marketing that has created and given rise to a better, more competitive sports is lost under their side as well, which means effectively many players lose out under their side. Then their contention was, but cricket has become a lot expensive. There are a lot of football clubs coaching that you can't afford, etc. We think that's untrue as well. If they are trying to say that Liverpool Football Club is not spending any more in the Liverpool city, then they are fundamentally untrue, right? The FSC group, which owns Liverpool, which is an American company, works hand in hand with the Liverpool City Council to ensure that there is grassroots development. That's the incentive they have for a couple of reasons, because these clubs, even though they have foreign ownership, they still want local support. They still want to go out and show themselves as someone worthy of representing clubs with heritage and history, so that they have more local support and they can garner more social responsibility, so that they will be able to do so. But further on, there are regulations that are in place that requires grassroots players to be incorporated into teams, right? For example, English Premier League has at least you need to have 15 players in your squad, grassroots players in your squad to compete in the league in the first place, which means there are effective incentives and regulations in place to ensure that these individuals are also represented and are also given a fair coaching abilities. We think they've ignored entirely. But further on, if they want to debate in cricket, which we think we agreed not to, we're going to debate on it as well, right? For example, first, if their concern is that format aren't necessarily promoted because of commercialization, we disagree to it as well. Cricket used to be an 8-team sport not a long year back. 8 teams played test cricket and all of the teams were not given an eye as well. Nowadays, countries like Afghanistan, countries like Nepal, other countries like, for example, Netherlands and Scotland strive to get that test status for themselves. It's because effectively cricket was commercialized to a degree where it can have a global market, which means now people know that there is cricket. Now people know that people play for 5 days, for God's sake. I don't know what's the point of it, but they do play for it. And then people will strive to ensure that if they want to play cricket, if they want to continue their career in playing cricket, they probably then want to go and achieve test status for themselves. I think it's detrimental to their case. In regards to skill, we think effectively with more money, with better coaches, etc., you will have better outcome too. Now on to social movements, and why do we think our side? Because of commercialization is social movement. When Kaepernick in 2017 took a knee during national anthem in the US in the game of NFL, Nike supported him. Nike said, just do it, and put a poster of Kaepernick taking a knee against police brutality. That effectively meant many consumers of Nike were also the audience of NFL knew that people do not like the amount of institutional racism that exists. In the present, every game before Premier League, all the players takes a knee for social, against police brutality. It's a symbol which says we are in it together. And this togetherness only exists because sports is globalized to a degree where there is an American black band playing for the same team, and that person potentially can be victimized in the US street driving a fancy car that they probably own, right? Which means these forms of global solidarity exists, and this form of global consciousness is there because of globalized nature of sports that effectively is not existing on their side. And because sports is so popular, because people like sports so much, because sports has this huge crazy fan base, it's then people subscribe to these things. That's the reason as to how social movements are better off, and that's how sports are. That's how sports is different than other celebrity cultures. For all of these reasons, we're incredibly proud to be at the right side of this debate. Thank you very much. I hope I was audible throughout.
Yes, yes. All right, so we would like to thank the second negative speaker for their speech. Now we invite the third proposition speaker, please. Here.
Yeah, hello, mic check. Am I audible?
I can hear you.
All right, I'll just start in 5. Yeah, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. All right, panel. Firstly, the burden that DLO comes up and puts on side affirmative here is that we haven't been able to pinpoint how the counterfactual narrative looks like, whereas we had entailed those counterfactual narratives within our arguments. Let me just flesh it out for you so that it is crystal clear in your adjudication sheet, so that you know that we have already dealt with it in our previous speeches, right? The first point being, we've dealt with how there are less likelihood of irrational choices due to the greed of money, and how the capitalization and the commercialization within the sport has pushed players and individuals to make decisions which are better for their own pocket or income, rather than betterment for their own sports betterment for their sports development or their growth as a sportsman in and of itself. The second point that we have argued within our arguments is that there is likelier to be less burden of expectations when the commercializations and the PR industry of the sports has not glorified and fetishized players to such an extent that when they are not able to perform or not meet the benchmark or the standard of expectation that this PR industry has set for them, they are the burden of expectation is reduced. The burden is reduced on the players to feel that there is the anxiety within the players, and the pressure that this individual might have to go through is reduced, and now the focus is now brought back to the basic techniques of the sports and how he or she needs to look at the training and the practice that he or she might need. We also tell you that the free choice exists within this within our counterfactual narrative as well. Why we say this is because now when you endorse certain brand or you are ambassador of certain companies, now you are restricted by the contractual nature of the agreement, that now you cannot no longer politically maybe align yourself or give out an opinion that might be too strong for the sentiments of the company that we've already dealt with in the DPM speech. Elaborating on that point, the DLO comes up and talks to you about how Nike has supported one of the players who came out and put a stand. But understand, this is not the full stop, right? This is not where the problem stops, right? The problem just starts at this point, where now you know that Nike might have supported you, but other brands in future who might be potential endorsers for you will no longer take you into consideration because of the opinion or stance that you're taking. We still see that the same problem still exists, because even if one company might endorse you, another future prospects of companies who might have taken you into consideration will no longer see feasible for you to be representative of the image of their brand, or be able to endorse their brands, right? Now, this is something that is less likelier in our counterfactual narrative. In our counterfactual narrative, the audience and the fans are likelier to be less disillusioned. Again, this coming back to the point of how they're less likely to be burden of expectations, and how the pressure of the pressure is released off of players, and the toxicity that surrounds within the sport is reduced to to a large extent, right? Now, coming to targeted rebuttals by on side oppositions, right? Now, the DLO comes up and tells you that there is an increased quality in their paradigm, and in the status quo they see that there is a likelihood of increased quality. We tell you that understand, first we have dealt with that understand that it is already that once you need, because the commercialization and glamorization of the sports in and of itself, we see that the training equipment and the training costs and the academies cost way higher, and the costs have increased to an amount that now only the privileged sections of the society are now able to access this, thereby taking down the argument that suddenly accessibility increases. But this accessibility is asymmetric, and the power asymmetry that exists in the society is also now represented within the sports themselves, right? This is something that we've been arguing for. And another layer of analysis to this is, now because of commercialization, anybody and any Tom, Dick, and Harry can now open academies and claim that they will be able to provide the training that is required. Now, the claim and the validity of the sports is likely to be decreased, is something that is decreased in our counterfactual narrative. Now, in the status quo where commercialization is very rampant, anybody who might have even played a state level tournament now, using that basis, opens a training and academy, might not be well technically equipped, might not have the proper knowledge. This is something that we've seen right now in India. When you talk about cricket, anybody can open an academy in a small park or in a small ground, where they are able to claim that they will be able to provide training, but might get the basics wrong in the very beginning. This is something that therefore the problem that they highlight, that the decrease in quality in our paradigm is something that is very rampant. We see this as a very inexclusive argument on their side. They also come up and talk to you about how commercialization has increased the sports purview and global access, and quoted the examples of cricket, where countries now want to engage and get the test status. Understand, this again has ignored the point how the current body that controls cricket regulations, the ICC, is also controlled by BCCI, because BCCI is able to garner more sponsors and has a huge capital to control the board's decision, and has employed the heads in such a way that the heads represents BCCI's interest. Right? So the sports has been commercialized to such an extent that now BCCI is able to dictate that only 10 countries will play the World Cup instead of 16 countries that previously played, because now it is more commercially viable. The BCCI and the ICC was able to change the format of Cricket World Cup last year, from having a round robin, from having a group stage format, to having a format where each country played every other country, and a round robin format, so that there are more number of matches that garner more sponsors and more viewership instead of the traditional way. This is something that we see that now the undue control that BCCI and ICC is able to put over sport, that only 10 countries will play World Cup, and rest of the the associated countries that they try to argue for that they will get access, no longer get access on the big stage. This is something that they fail to address in their speeches. Right now, the other argument that is very essential in our case was of patriarchy, and how this has entrenched the sports. Right now, the objectification of players to such an extent that a Virat Kohli will be worth a 109 crore deal with Puma, but a Mithali Raj, who is the captain of who is the captain of Indian cricket team, is not at the same level and will not get the same result. Right now, on the point of social movements and racism and homophobia that they try to argue for, understand, the bilateral tensions between the countries have also been increased at the same time, where the hatred between the amongst the fans when it comes to India-Pakistan matches has been increased to such an extent that the fans have been trolling on the internet, where there's now less incentive, where the toxicity has been increased to such an extent that fans engage in trolling. The fans take out marches to burn the photos of the players. The outright hatred to players when they throw bottles and equipment on the ground while they are viewing the and spectating the cricket match. And for all those reasons, we are very proud to propose.
We would like to thank the third proposition speaker for their speech. Now, to finally conclude the constructive of the negative bench, we now call in the third negative speaker, please. Here.
Hi, can we get a couple of seconds? I think our friend has been dropped
Yeah,
off
all
the
right.
call.
Am I audible?
Is your net connection okay?
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes, you
This
are.
time? Okay, thank you. Okay, panel, first I'm going to start with pointing out some problems that I found in the case of the affirmative side today. First, they showed certain problems with sports in the status quo, which is commercialized. And they never tell us why those problems go away in their side when there exists a world where sports is never commercialized. For example, they say there is patriarchy in sports and only male sports gain traction and limelight. Brand go for Dhoni over a female sports person, and that's bad. Okay, but they never tell us that in a counterfactual world where sports is never commercialized, why female sports players would gain limelight, right? Imagine a world where there is no money in sports. That means that like football is not as commercialized as it is in the status quo, and in that world you play but you don't earn money by playing. There is less incentive for females to go into sports in the beginning, right? But more importantly, even if they want to go to sports, there does not exist enough avenues, enough grounds, because you don't have enough money for making that sports commercialized. Understand what we told you from the beginning of our first speech, right? We told you that sports in the status quo makes a lot of profit because of commercialization, because of viewership it's get, because of fans that watch the sports, because of funding that comes in. This funding then is used to make sports not just more global but also more inclusive. That is, you get a World Cup for women in the status quo because you have money that allows us to conduct that World Cup. You have viewership for that World Cup also, right? So in the counterfactual world, we not get that altogether. We think that sports is becoming more liberal, and in the status quo, because of commercialization, more and more people are coming in. So they cannot just give us an argument and not give us any comparative and tell us that like the status quo is bad and that is why we regret it and prefer another world which is worse, right? So we think on feminist front, the funding that has come has made this world a lot better. Secondly, they say commodification of players leads to players becoming depressed because because they are commodified, because they want to make more, right? But then again, there is one problem, right? They don't give us uh, they don't give us a picture of what happens to players when they are not commodified at all. Imagine that you play certain sports all your life but don't make enough money to feed your family. You're not able, you still have to work another job even when you're playing for your country, like many sports people have to do in many developing parts of the world, right? That means that you're not able to give time to sports and not become better. That means sports becomes less inclusive and is limited to rich people who play sports for leisure and can contribute a lot of their time to playing sport rather than doing any other job, right? So in a world where you cannot make money by playing sport, you are actually making sports about only rich elite people living in certain parts of a country or certain parts of the world being able to get access to sports and being able to play those sports, because you'd never get Dhoni from Ranchi coming in to play for India and becoming the captain of India if sports was not commercialized, right? Because commercialization of sports, which brought a lot of money, meant you built a lot of grounds, means you had a lot of selectors who went to different parts of the country trying to like gain talents, right? You got training centers all around the country, and like many people trying to like invest in sports players or sports persons, seeing that there is potential for these people to play for their country and like make money. We think all of these means that in their side of the house there will be more depression, because you're not being able to like make money at all by sports, or many times you're not going into sports and choosing an alternative career even if you could have made it big playing sports, because like you don't have an option, because like your family will not permit it, because you cannot make money by becoming a sports person. We think that is a world where there is more depression, right? So they think like even in that front, we think commodification to certain degree has become good, right? But more importantly, we also told you that oftentimes there are players who play for their local clubs and continue playing for their local clubs because they value that over money, right? And it is good, right? Because at least players have a choice to make money or become loyal, and that choice does not exist in their side of the house at all, right? In their side of the house, all you get is like either leave sports or continue playing without money and struggle. We think that is a world where there is more depression, and in that comparative we should win, right? Then we get one concession from them. They say that they still want test cricket to exist. They still want certain players like Rahul Dravid or certain formats to be promoted even now, right? Even when 2020 cricket exists, they want test cricket also to exist. But understand that the reason why sports exist, why so many people like associate with sports and want to go to sports, is because sports is commercialized, is because there is, because it has a lot of access, because you can become a star playing football or cricket. It's because like there is a lot of investment going in. It's because you can make money after playing sports. That would not exist at all, right? So like sports itself becoming better is something that you get in our side of the house, where you have a lot of investment coming in, where managers are better, coaches are better, where there are a lot of grounds, and where like people, if want to, can join training centers and play, right? In their side of the house that would not happen at all, because people would not go to training centers to train, because after training they don't reach the end goal that they would reach in our side of the house. We think because of that, we think sports and their formats being preserved is something that happens better in our side. But more importantly, we told you from DLO that sports has become more globalized today, because like even country like Nepal is being able to play in the World Cup, right? But more importantly, we have players playing in leagues in India, like or Nepali player playing in IPL, or a player from Egypt playing in Premier League, is something that makes sports popular in these countries also, right? That means more and more people from these countries are able to access sports and gain benefits or happiness from watching that sport. We think that becomes better. And we also told you about decreased racism and Islamophobia that happens because of commercialization of sports. Because when, imagine you playing for a club and people from different nationality coming together and playing together, right? That means even if you were a person from one country, when you see another person, an African person coming and playing for a club, then you support that club, thereby you support him scoring goals, which leads to decreased racism overall, right? That means that that feeling of people coming together happens better. We got an argument from DPM. We said, oh, because of commercialization, India Pakistan matches become like so advertised, right? But understand that if commercialization does not exist, that enmity would still exist, right? But enmity, or the idea of nationalism and media channels being able to strongman nationalism, certainly decreases when you have players coming in and playing together. For instance, if West Indies player from West Indies come and play together with Indian players in Indian Premier League, you get like Indian fans supporting players in West Indies. Therefore, you cannot play that national card when the match between West Indies and India happens next time, right? We think that idea means people can come together and there is decreased feeling of enmity between people. But more importantly, when people become stars themselves, like Mohamed Salah today, or any African American playing basketball in the United States, can stand against racism because of his celebrity status. But more importantly, the league itself is liberalizing, right? For all the examples that we gave you from DLO, we told you that league itself is liberalizing and standing for certain liberal values, which we can support because of the fan base that we enjoy today, because sports is so commercialized. We think all of that would never happen in their side. Therefore, This commercialization has not just led to increased profit for sports and making sports better, but more importantly has led to we being able to create a world which is more liberal on that front, right? So on because we don't get any comparative from them, and we give you so many benefits to commercialization, we think we should win. We're very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Yeah, we would like to thank the third negative speaker for their speech. And finally, to conclude the case of the negative bench, we now call on the negative reply, please. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
All right, so I'll start in a few seconds. Panel, ladies and gentlemen, sports is a spectator sport or spectator program. That is to mean there is no inherent value to running around at your home or playing football with your friends other than the value that the player receives itself. But this value multiplies and magnifies as a lot of people across countries are able to access that. In the side government's world, I will not have a pleasure to see Messi get past 1, 2, 3, 4 and score. The reason is Messi would not be Messi without the kind of, if Barcelona did not have an extra commercial money available to scout him at Argentina, probably to buy him to Barcelona, probably to train him to become the player he is. But I also would not have access in regards to the Spanish Premier League that I would otherwise not have in my side of the house. They would deny us of the happiness of Liverpool's trophy when Liverpool would have alternatively meant nothing to me, because it's a country, it's a place that would only have significance in local level in their side of the house, while that significance magnifies to global level, that magnifies the amount of pleasure we can have from the sports because of commercial incentive being there. But then it's important to note, what about the players and their skills and ability? Some players have skills that can be marketable. Some players are effective in scoring goals or probably playing like Rahul Dravid in the side. That is why if there is a glory to be had out of it, all of these players are going to be respected. But more important than that, a lot of these players now have an incentive to become someone they never dreamt of when the field wasn't lucrative at all. So the for-profit incentive that they want to prioritize is the capital that will grant power to the sports that it alternatively did not have. Because notice, people who are like playing normally are centralized to places like Madrid, centralized to places like Bayern Munich. In the alternative world, they would win all the leagues. That would be all the sports is all about. In our side, even Leicester City can win the league, because the fact is we have increased access to the coaches from throughout the world. In our world, we have Graham Roberts from Tottenham, who was once a Tottenham captain, coaching Nepal, for instance, that would never have occurred without the commercial incentives being in place. This means that the Nepali players get a unique perspective of the style of play that only occurred in England. That side government would have us restrict there. But it also looks like a lot of inspiration I can get by having a Neymar in my team, or like a good player from an international community in my team that reflects the image of the players or the capacity that they can have. But it's important to note that these players are not just players. They are role models that grease the problems of the hatred that side government would like to place. Because notice, it's important to note that India-Pakistan hatred has nothing to do with sports. It has a lot of political issues relating to that. But the fact is, cricket has been able to bridge that gap and probably has been able to unite these communities for far too long than it is imaginable. It looks like how Atletico Bilbao fans stand up to give an ovation for Messi's goal. It looks like how Mohamed Salah stands to bridge Islamophobic hatred in EPL, in England, in United States, in all the places in the world. Because the fact is, these people stand as role models for their specific community, who can inspire the local communities, but also give us the pleasure of football that would alternatively be denied in their side of the house. Commercialization simply has increased incentives to popularize sports. Popularized sports means increased access, better trainings, better sports, and better pleasure to be had out of all of this. We are very proud to oppose because of that. Thank you.
We would like to thank the negative reply for this speech, and to conclude this round, we now call in the affirmative reply, please. Here.
Is this audible to the chair?
Yes.
All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel comparatives in this debate. Firstly, in terms of burden of expectations that is thrusted upon the players, point at which their entire worth is contingent on valuation of a price tag. We've argued to you from the first speech itself why it puts an unexpected burden on these individuals and forces them and coerces them to make irrational choices and like make choices contingent on capital. Like an example would be like Oscar literally going to China because like China offered him way more, like tons more money that he could have perhaps like developed himself as a player, continuing to play in the English Premier League. At that point of time, we feel that this burden of expectations is why your entire choices and your like disposition as a player is contingent on commercial gains, rather than say like you making rational choices is something that greatly reduces. Also, like the opposition is called like like fanning over the word counterfactual. We have already told you throughout our speeches that the comparative already existed, which is the comparative to this is the players making way more rational choices and they're not being swayed by commercial incentives, so on and so forth. But still, what is the response to this? The response to this is where dreams are important and dreams need to be realized. We have told you, and their example is, look, Pele has made it to the top and Dhoni has made it to the top. Look, Pele made it in a world where commercialization did not exist, which means if access is something they had to argue, then it's anyway a self-defeating argument, because even on their side of the house, Pele or even like Kapil, there were people who essentially played for India historically and made it big, did so without commercialization existing. We don't think as to why that argument is exclusive anyway on their side of the house. But we also don't know barriers to entry is high, point at which it's contingent on equipment, as Joanne argued through a DPM speech. The point at which is commercialized, you're contingent to get the best possible equipment. And also, what's the metric of success? People like Roger Federer sell because they have a marketable face, they have an attractive face that can get branding, which means your metric of success through this commercial world is also contingent on your physical appearance. The point at which you set so many high barriers to entry, which means the simply means point at which it becomes difficult for people who are from disenfranchised backgrounds, who perhaps may not have the physical looks to essentially be marketable and sold, don't get those sponsorship and deals that the side negative claims to be, which is at this side of the house. On our side of the house, you still have at least an egalitarian approach through which people enter. Also, thirdly, in terms of this weird problem of racism that they want to solve, firstly, Joanne responded by saying it's like in terms of principle, players are much more less likely to take radical stances and are much more likely to take hypocritic stances because of the commercial leanings that they have, that you don't want to piss off Nike by taking a radical stance on a political issue just simply because it can upset a certain group of people. Also, they say this, some level of integration takes place which comes through in the whip, that like say for example, if I play for a certain team, people are likely to support me. Like we think this only happens in the best case scenario, point at which if the team wins, people go, a white male in the English Premier League can go ahead and support Yaya Toure. Point at which Manchester City loses a match, Yaya Toure faced criticism and was called out, and racist slurs were thrown against him, because of which he feels that because he was the reason Manchester City lost that match. We also think point at which teams lose, they also get like the asymmetric burden of like taking that win on themselves, which means if they win, the development is symmetrical, the appreciation is symmetrical, but point at which the team loses, Yaya Toure faced those racist slurs in that Manchester City game, which is point at which you lose, you're much more likely to face that asymmetric burden. Also, one more thing, in terms of gambling and in terms of why this commercialization leads to a toxic environment, as Joanne argued through a DPM speech, were completely unengaged. That is to say, when these match fixing scandals come up, that is to say, it's much more profitable for companies to make a match as close as possible, which is literally led to match fixing scandals, which is this leads to disillusionment, which means if they want to argue from their side how their fans get profit and like the spectator value increases, spectator value also decreases and like dramatically decreases, point at which, say for example, these match fixing scandals take place, which are only likely to increase, point at which commercialization takes place, which is on our side of the house, you still don't have these things coming up to this extent, and like at least there's a drastic reduction of these things happening. Finally, what we have told you on our side of the house, that point at which you like prefer a world without commercialization, you create an egalitarian approach. That's to say, even in terms of patriarchy, it's not that patriarchy is present on both sides of the house. Point at which like media capitalizes on these vulnerable tendencies, women get to lose out a way more, which means the barrier to entry becomes way higher, and like there's a deadlock created that you can't resolve. On our side of the house, you still have an egalitarian approach to essentially continue with sports, and you essentially don't have the problems that essentially exclusively creep in, point at which it's commercialized. For all these reasons,
Yeah, so we would like to thank the proposition reply for their speech and like to thank all of the debaters for this round. So I guess